The Supreme Court's gun carry case reaches new levels of popularity. Plus, the High Court also vacates and remands a pro-gun ruling. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end. So we want to kick this one off with some new polling information on the Supreme Court's major gun rights decision, obviously the Bruen decision. We've covered this pretty extensively, just the fact that this has been one of the more popular decisions the Supreme Court has handed down. But it actually, according to the latest data, is more popular than it's ever been.
Yeah, pretty surprising, too. It continues to climb in popularity 2 years out from when it was handed down. And now it's, according to the latest Marquette Law School poll, it's at 70% approval, 30% disapproval, or 70% support and 30% oppose. And they break that down further. And the plurality is actually strong support at 40%. And there's only like, I think 13% that are strongly opposed. So pretty remarkable to see from a ruling like Bruen that has been really very controversial inside of the gun world, at least as far as, obviously a pro-gun side is very happy with the ruling and the new standard it set up. And then the gun control groups are obviously, and gun control advocates are very unhappy with it. So to see it maintain that level of popularity 2 years on, and even actually continue to gain in popularity is pretty interesting. Now it's only a slight uptick from the last time they did this poll, but it's actually like a 6-point gain from the first time that they did it. So pretty significant uptick in support. And at the same time, it's happening when the court is losing popularity itself, right? That a lot of people view it as too conservative, that they really did not like the overturning of Roe v. Wade. In this poll, if you look through the last 2 years, that's the most unpopular decision. They didn't like the presidential immunity decision either. The court's approval rating has been underwater since it handed down, Bruen, but also, Dobbs mainly is the, I think, driving force behind that. And they've stayed underwater, meaning they're more people view the Supreme Court unfavorably than favorably at this point. And that's been the case since the middle of 2022 when these consequential rulings were handed down. So to see Bruen be popular in that environment and continue to gain popularity is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, especially because, like you said, this poll not only does it ask about Bruen, but it asks about several of the high profile, more culture wars type decisions that have really divided, at least the political class. And Bruen is the second most popular out of that handful that they've polled. So that again sort of stands out as the Supreme Court has sort of come under fire as the lasting unpopularity of the Dobbs decision has sort of plagued its reputation. Not only has it grown in popularity, but it stands out among some of these high profile decisions for its popularity.
Yeah, it's only second to the decision on affirmative action where they said that race can't be a factor in school admissions. That I believe is a bit more popular, almost 80%. Yeah. So, but Bruen is second of the rulings that they asked about. And really popular across the board among basically every sub-demographic that you see in the poll. Yeah. And look, I wish there was more polling on this so that we could get an even better view of what's going on. This is one poll. Now, they've been asking it for a while now, and they've done several iterations of it. So you can, I don't think this is necessarily an outlier or anything like that. We've seen the popularity has been consistent since it was handed down. And of course, when you dig into the crosstabs at the different demographics in the poll, you're looking at smaller and smaller groups of people that become less representative of the potential particular demographic as you dig down. But one thing that's interesting and still worth taking away from the poll is that across all demographic categories, essentially, race, gender, income level, religion, they all have popular, even party ID. While there's a huge gap still between Republicans who are almost entirely approving of Bruen, and Democrats, that you still see that Democrats, there's still a bare majority, 51%, that approve of Bruen. So it's pretty remarkable to see that when it comes to a politically polarizing question like gun rights, or politically polarizing issue, tends to be politically polarizing. Your views on guns in polling tend to be broken down by what party people say they belong to. But in this case, and you do still see that effect, but even with that in mind, you have Democrats approving, a majority of them, of Bruen. So that's kind of fascinating, especially because it's so disliked by the other side of the aisle from the gun control advocates. Like, there's academics and activists really don't like Bruen, and government officials who have to defend their gun restrictions under Bruen, they don't like Bruen at all, right? It's been a hotly contested decision since it came out, and it seems the public feels otherwise. Now, I will say, though, that the really hotly contested part of Bruen is the standard that it sets up, the test, the Second Amendment test that is included in the case. And that has been the part that's gotten a lot of the attention after it was handed down. And it is not the part that is asked about in this poll. The poll asked about the main holding, which is that people have a right to carry a gun outside the home for self-defense. That's what the poll asks about, whether you approve of this position that the Supreme Court has taken. And that's what people are approving of, more so than, more so than the Bruen test necessarily. Although, to caveat that, like I said, that's what all the discussion around Bruen has been about since it was handed out. So anybody who's followed this at all will understand what Bruen did and what this Bruen standard is. And so I would imagine some of that at least gets picked up in this poll. But primarily, it seems people are reacting to the idea of carrying a gun for self-defense. They like that.
Right. Those are all important caveats for sure. One other thing that, we've talked about this before as we've covered when these polls are released, is what Bruen really was. That core holding really came at the tail end of a broader cultural shift and a political shift where most of the country had already adopted this as their, at least in statute, as their practice. Gun carrying, concealed carry became more popular culturally. And I think you see some of that reflected in the crosstabs, where the oldest respondents tended to have the lowest, or not still a majority, but lower approval than the youngest respondents to that core holding decision. I think that's interesting, because to me, that reflects a cultural shift where maybe some of those older respondents were more closer to gun culture 1.0, for example, where gun carry was less common. And these younger respondents are in a world where, gun culture 2.0, concealed carry for self-defense has been sort of a ubiquitous practice among gun owners. And I think that's interesting that we actually see that reflected in the data. That's
a good point, because, if you're older, you probably grew up at a time where concealed carry was illegal in most of the country.
Right.
It wasn't really until the 1990s that started to change. So, if you're over 40, 50, you probably recall the days when you could not conceal carry a gun in most states. And if you're in your 30s, 20s, you probably don't remember any of that.
Right.
And you've grown up in an era where the vast majority of the country allows you to carry a gun with either a permit that's relatively simple to get if you don't have a criminal history, or they don't require a permit at all for people who can legally possess firearms. Right. So, it definitely, Bruen came at the tail end of that cultural shift. Just like with Heller came after the idea of banning handguns was already very unpopular, and there weren't many handgun bans across the country, outside of, San Francisco, right, as we reported on at the time. That was Kamala Harris, and the San Francisco city government was very much on the fringes when they passed their handgun ban in 2005, and then saw it struck down at the same time that Heller happened, which she, of course, also filed an amicus brief supporting the DC handgun ban. But the point is, by then, the vast majority of the country was no longer supporting that kind of restriction, this sort of handgun bans. And so the Supreme Court has kind of followed those trends. They haven't been leading them up to this point, at least. But I guess that's maybe brings us into what we're going to talk about next, which is more Supreme Court stuff, right? That they are doing. We already know that they're doing 2 gun cases this term, right? We talked about oral arguments in the so-called ghost gun kit case that just went down. They also have accepted the Smith & Wesson Mexico fight, and now they have taken action on a 3rd gun case, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah. So the state of Pennsylvania had appealed a Third Circuit decision that essentially struck down Pennsylvania's policy of prohibiting gun carry, open carry during declared states of emergency. There's a carve out that if you have a concealed carry permit, you're permitted to continue carrying during those emergency declarations. But Pennsylvania, like a number of states, restricts who can apply for concealed carry permits to those 21 and older. So if you're between the ages of 18 to 20, you had no avenue to lawfully carry a firearm during those emergency declarations. And a group of young gun owners sued over that because Pennsylvania was under like a 3-year straight period of emergency declarations from COVID.
These things suddenly became very, pre-COVID, it was kind of emergency situation. Like it might be a local thing for during some sort of natural disaster, but COVID kind of changed a lot of perspectives on the emergency carve-outs that we have in some of these gun laws.
Right. And it was pretty stretched even before COVID. I think the opioid crisis prompted Governor Tom Wolf, former Pennsylvania governor, to declare an emergency declaration. So it was a very extended period where those under the age of 21 who could lawfully own a gun had no avenue to carry. And so they sued. It worked its way up to the Third Circuit. The Third Circuit struck that down and said young adults have a Second Amendment protected right to carry a firearm in some form or fashion. So Pennsylvania appealed that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a decision on that. And instead of either accepting the case in full or denying it entirely, they did what we've covered before. They granted, vacated, and remanded it. So basically they threw out that Third Circuit decision, sent it back to the Third Circuit to hear again, and said, you need to consider our Rahimi jurisprudence, hear it again. And so that's where it stands. Sort of a unexpected, I think, outcome from a lot of observers.
Yeah, I think a lot of gun rights advocates were pretty sure the court was going to take this one up and do a full case on it instead of this, which is kind of a sidestep maneuver. It's interesting, right, to see the court do this again, because they did this after Rahimi, right? There's a slew of cases, a slate that they could have taken up to dive deeper into the questions that they were, starting to answer with Rahimi. And instead, what did they do, right? They GBR'd all those cases and said, go back and do these again after looking at what we wrote in Rahimi. And the issue there, right, is that I think you and I are in agreement on this, and it's so far what we've seen from those lower courts is that they're not going to be impacted by Rahimi in any discernible way necessarily. The lower courts involved, they're probably not going to change how they viewed the case because of what the court wrote in Rahimi, but the court seems to not be at all interested in taking Second Amendment cases unless the ruling that they're dealing with already directly addressed what the court wrote in Rahimi. So maybe it's just kind of a bookkeeping thing for them. They don't want to get involved until everyone at the lower courts has their I's dotted and their T's crossed on including every single piece of the admittedly extremely limited Supreme Court Second Amendment jurisprudence. So I don't know what you take away from it. That's what I would take away. I don't know if you have a different view on like what else we could think of why they're doing this, why they did this in this case and in those previous cases.
Yeah, that is possible because you have seen this before in other contexts, right? The Supreme Court they're sticklers on deference to making sure the lower courts have their full procedures in place. Yeah. That's why they've, for example, said multiple times they don't want to take cases that are in an interlocutory posture. They want the lower courts to fully flesh out the cases before they consider taking them. So it is possible that, hey, we handed down another
gun context.
At least in the gun context, right? So
I would say
it is possible.
They're plenty happy to take other cases on that, in the shadow docket and things like that. They don't seem inclined to do that for Second Amendment cases.
Sure. But the other potential is maybe they just have a different idea of what Rahimi meant for the Second Amendment law than outside observers like you or I, or perhaps even the lower courts think. Maybe they really do.
Pointless to us, right? Like,
yeah.
Why would what happened in Rahimi doesn't seem to have any obvious impact on what the Third Circuit ruled in this 18 to 21-year-old case or 18 to 20-year-old case.
Right. It makes more sense to me. Like, for example, the first round of GVRs they did was felon in possession type cases. And you could make you can see how that might possibly be at least similar to Rahimi because it's dealing with who can be prohibited and which circumstances can you prohibit. Age limits is a little bit different there. It's not, dangerousness doesn't really come into play so much because there's not an alleged, background or criminal record to try to evaluate.
Because you're talking about a group of people.
Yeah, you're just talking about a category of individuals, not based on conduct, but based on their age. Right. So to me, it doesn't make sense how Rahimi would impact that. But maybe the court thinks that they did a lot more in Rahimi than the rest of us do. So that could be.
It could be. To me, it's just like, I don't know. It feels like they're just kicking these things down the road, like just kicking the can down the road. We'll deal with this another day. Maybe they don't like the case because it's more of a limited question on the 18, 21-year-olds' Second Amendment rights because it's about carrying in an emergency state. And there are probably other cases that get at the broader question of, because there's a lot of laws that just impact 18 to 20-year-olds. Florida, for instance, has their assault ban for just 18 to 20-year-olds. There's a lot of states that do that kind of stuff, even just the handguns at the federal level, right? 18 to 21-year-olds can't buy handguns legally from licensed dealers. So, there's other avenues that could get at a broader question. Maybe that's what they want. I don't know. So, it's impossible. They don't say anything, right? They didn't. Right. Nobody on the court wrote anything about why they did it this way. They just said, go back and apply Rahimi, even if everybody watching is, I think, pretty much in agreement that there's not going to be any difference when it comes back up after applying Rahimi. Yeah. It's
like I said, it's much harder in this case to read the tea leaves than in other instances where they wrote separately or a couple of justices have noted that, we would have taken this case, even though the rest of us didn't want to.
Even there, like the ghost gun case, right, where you had notes that 4 of the justices would have allowed the lower court's injunction to stay in place during appeal. That sort of implied that they were perhaps on the side of the program plaintiffs in that case. And then when we got to oral arguments, that didn't seem to be the impression that oral arguments gave at all. So sometimes you just can't know. Honestly.
That is true. But we'll have to see, obviously, like in the context of their other GVRs, we're already seeing them come back with the same decisions as we kind of predicted. Not much would change. Yeah. Maybe if that keeps happening, then we'll start to see a different behavior from this court. But to date, it just certainly does seem like they're any decision that came up pre-Rahimi, it does seem like the kick the can strategy is where they're headed.
Any of these cases that you're trying to get up to the court, I hope you got an opinion that incorporates Rahimi into it, because otherwise it doesn't seem like they're going to say yes.
Right.
But, you know, they could have also just, I mean, there's a lot of ways they could have done this. They could have just denied cert and left the lower court decision in place. So that sort of implies that they weren't happy with the lower court decision, or they want to weigh in themselves, but they don't want to do it right now. I don't know. Hard to say.
It's tough to say. Some of the other stories we have this week, won't get into too much because they deal with sort of the NRA and Doug Hamlin and the allegations that came out that you covered extensively this week. We'll get into those in more detail with the main interview podcast with our guest this week, Cam Edwards. So listeners should definitely check that out if they want to learn more. We also get into some of the spending that's going on. The gun groups, gun control groups are certainly spending, and the NRA is trying to match some of that as well.
Yeah. And that's sort of one of the big reasons why the whole NRA animal cruelty scandal that's going on, that we'll get more into on the interview podcast, matters, because it has, beyond just the specifics of the actual story, because it has an impact on the organization and its ability to influence the election and raise money and do anything else. And we've already seen it's been very much hampered over the last half decade. It's still not finished with its previous scandal, right? They still have not settled the New York civil case fully. They have not. That is not at its final conclusion yet. There's still lots of infighting inside the organization between reformers and the people who were Wayne LaPierre allies for a long time. Yeah, there's still so much turmoil going on. And we've seen that play out this year as we've tracked this, right? You've done a lot of the fundraising stories to this point. And, I wrote this one, but we've seen the gun control groups have pressed an advantage when it comes to raising money to be spent in the elections. And now we're seeing them actually spend that money, right?
Right. Yeah. No, it certainly seems like, we talked about, they made these big outlandish pledges, and how there's reason to be a little skeptical, because in past elections, they've done the same thing and didn't actually follow through. They certainly appear to be on track, at least according to announced ad buys and dollar amounts. They certainly seem to be on track to hitting those, which is a notable change.
Because, and there's more or less, there's a couple ways to track political spending. The main one, the most reliable one, is FEC filings, which is what we write about every month, but they only come out once a month, right? And you only get around the 20th of every month, you get the previous month's FEC filings. So they're delayed. You're not going to know everything before the election happens. You're going to be, like a month and a half behind, oftentimes on these, the government reports. And then the other way to track it is that sometimes these groups will come out and say, hey, we're doing this ad buy here. One of the other ways, there's a few, but the other big way is just following them and seeing what they say. And they've been saying a lot lately, the gun control groups, right?
Yeah, no, that's certainly announcing multi-million-dollar ad buys in swing states and down ballot races. It's an avalanche of spending as we're getting close to the election here. It's interesting that a lot of it seems to be partnered with other outside PACs. Certainly Everytown is doing this. I think that's a little bit new. It
is interesting, yeah.
It's joint announcements, so maybe that's helping them meet that big fundraiser or planned spending pledge.
Yeah, it does kind of. I was thinking of that as well when I was writing the story, because it's not all of this money is coming from them, right?
Right.
Like they announced $9 million I think was it $4 million in a couple of Senate races in Michigan and Pennsylvania, right? Two big key Senate races, and that Democrats are trying to hold on to. And they announced that in conjunction with the Senate Majority PAC, which is the Democrats, Senate PAC. And so it doesn't say what the breakdown is as to who's giving what amount, if it's 50-50 or what. But yeah, it does seem like a way of them juicing the numbers a bit to one, also a way of coordinating too with people who are trying to do the same thing that you're trying to do. And every town has long been doing that, right? For, especially on the issue side, like a lot of their ads are not just gun ads. They're also usually abortion ads as well. And they've been doing that for several election cycles, and they're continuing to do that here. But I noticed that as well. I thought it was interesting, like how much of this money is actually coming from Everytown and how much is coming from these other groups that they're partnering with. I mean, they really are spreading their money advantage around too, I would say, is another key point. We talked, you mentioned the NRA has an ad campaign, and they told me they're spending 7 figures on a radio ad campaign in Pennsylvania, which, this is something we've talked about a couple of times. And I think in the Tim Miller podcast that we did last week, harped on this quite a bit. Like the Harris's background, her record, includes these efforts to ban possession of guns, the mandatory buybacks, essentially confiscatory. Yeah. Anyway, confiscation. Let's just say it that way. And so, that's something that you would think in what has become, for at least the remaining undecided voters, which is a tiny sliver, right, of people, but there's sort of a race to define her for them. And you would think that would obviously be the Republican or pro-Trump, pro-gun side trying to define her as somebody who's very radical who has a very radical record on this stuff. And so you'd think they'd be out there doing ads on this, and the Trump campaign's not doing it. And we hadn't seen a lot of evidence of the NRA doing it either. They have done it a little bit, but this new ad does try to get at that. And it is a 7-figure ad. My guess, they don't say exactly how much. I tend to think when someone won't say the number and they just give you the figures, 7 figures, 6 figures, it's probably on the lower end of that mark. It might be literally just a single $1 million. We don't know, but usually if you're spending $9 million, you're probably not just saying 7 figures, right? That's my personal opinion on that one. So take it as you will, but it's 7 figures. It's still a significant amount of money for an ad campaign on the radio. And it is all about her record of supporting primarily mandatory buybacks of assault weapons, because they have actual clips of her saying that from 2019, right? And they call her Confiscation Kamala. It's a minute-long ad. You guys can go and read the story if you want to see any of these ads. And so it does try to do that. We've talked about why aren't they doing this? Could they even? One of the big questions is, does the NRA even have the resources to really make an impact with that? And so they are trying, 7-figure ad directly around Harris's history of backing these sorts of proposals. And so, but that's pales in comparison to the 15 million plus that these gun control groups are spending, and they're spreading it around. There's the Michigan and Pennsylvania Senate ads are the biggest federal races that they're in. A lot of this other spending is in state legislative races across the country. It's primarily in battleground states like Arizona and Michigan, but it's they've even got ads going up in school board races. They have a 6-figure campaign, again, in conjunction with another group in school board races in like Miami and Atlanta. So, they're really trying to press their money advantage at this point, I think.
Yeah, they certainly are. And like you said, we'll continue to report on this stuff as we get more updated data and more granular detail. But like you said, it'll be a little bit delayed. And to hear more about this sort of stuff and the NRA and the implications, obviously, once again, listeners should check out the full-length interview podcast with Cam.
Yeah.
Getting into some of the newsletter links this week. The first one comes to us from the Dispatch, and it features prominently something you contributed this week, talking about the potential ramifications of either a Kamala Harris or Donald Trump presidency on gun politics.
Yeah, they put together a pretty good series over there of just trying to ask experts what they thought the policy outcomes would be for, economics and social issues. I recommend reading all of them, but the one that I contribute, obviously, about gun policy, and it's something we haven't talked a ton about, and I do think is worth getting into a little bit here. You guys should read the full piece, but one of the takeaways to me when you look at them, they have obviously neither one has focused a great deal on the details of their gun policy proposals, right? They kind of focused on broad-based stuff. Harris has talked about 3 specific policies, but not in much detail. Universal background checks, red flag laws, assault weapons ban, at least for sales and not mandatory buybacks. That's her current position. Not a lot of detail on exactly how she would do those things or what the context, like red flag laws. What does that mean as a policy proposal from a presidential candidate? Is it going to be a federal red flag law? Is it going to be encouraging states to adopt red flag laws like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act already does? I don't know. We don't know. And then on the other side, Trump probably even less detailed on exactly what he would do policy-wise as president on guns. Just most of his stuff focuses, he's talked about replacing the ATF director, right? That's something substantial and specific. Undoing all of Biden's executive orders or executive actions on guns. Okay. Specific thing. He said he would sign a national reciprocity bill if it ever made it to his desk. Yeah. So those are kind of the specifics that you'll get out of a Trump speech on this stuff occasionally. But obviously most of it's focused on saying that Harris will take your guns and he won't take your guns, and that he'll protect your gun rights, but in fairly generic terms. And when you think through the reality, I guess, of what they could do if elected, we talked a little bit about this with Tim Miller last week on the practical aspect. Now, one thing I want to, I guess, caveat, because this is something I always think about actually when we covering this stuff, like how, this all assumes that things would stay relatively normal in the way that they've been in our governmental structure and stuff like that. And I don't know, that's one of the things that a lot of people are concerned about with Donald Trump, is that he talks about retribution. He talks about, going after the enemy from within, all these things that he tried to undo the last election. There's this kind of stuff where it's like, I don't know, talking about these policy proposals like it's a normal race. Is that the right approach? I honestly don't know. Are we talking about second level stuff when there's first level stuff at play in this election? I don't know. But if we assume that either of these candidates get elected and they don't radically change our government and the way it works, then when you look at the policy implications, I think it becomes clear that it's going to be hard for either one of them to do a lot in practice, right? Like, if Harris wins, first of all, she's probably going to be hampered by a Republican Senate. That's what the polling indicates now, that Republicans are likely to pick up 2 seats and have a bare majority in the Senate. And so she'd have to contend with that for anything she wants to do that goes beyond executive action. The executive action, to kind of a shortcut to the end of my argument here, is where most of this is going to happen, because even if either of these candidates gets control of Congress, which is much more likely under Trump than it is under Harris at this point, again, based on the polling. They will still face an uphill battle of getting enough support for the things they want to do to actually pass legislation on them. National reciprocity, for instance, it's unlikely that you're going to see 60 votes for that, even in a Republican-controlled Senate that has 51 Republican votes. The assault weapons ban, same problem. And then obviously you get into that's where like nuking the filibuster or comes in as the other concern about the changing the makeup of government from the Democratic side, because Harris has supported that. If she were to get 50 or 51 senators, that's something she might pursue. That would be a not necessarily unconstitutional change to the makeup of our government, but it would be a very significant one with very serious consequences for how government functions, and could lead to passage of any number of policies at that point. But of course, then you would also have to deal with the Supreme Court, which is unlikely to approve assault weapons ban. We don't know for sure on that point, but it's the court has obviously been much more protective of Second Amendment rights of late than any time prior in its history. And of course, obviously, nuking filibuster could lead to packing the court, which is another thing that Harris has supported and could significantly, while not necessarily unconstitutional, could be, again, a significant change to the makeup of our government. And so I guess that's the thing, like where you come down on how likely the major changes to the makeup of our government could determine what you think the likelihood is. If you don't think that either one of these candidates is going to either be able to significantly change how the government functions or wants to necessarily, obviously there are plenty of people who don't think Donald Trump is going to try and do some of the things he talks about doing. Right. It's hard to talk through that when it's just really very much depends on where you think these people would actually push things to, either Trump or Harris, and how you come down on that. But all else the same, if there's no major change to how the government functions and we're still in the same basic framework we've been in, it's very hard to see any significant gun legislation passing under either of these presidents without, getting to a 60 vote majority in the Senate, which is not likely to happen anytime soon. And so that leaves executive actions where, again, the Supreme Court has been more restrictive on what federal agencies can do without new legislation authorizing it. So that probably limits a lot of what could be done through executive action. And so Trump probably has a little more leeway there because he could, for instance, remake the ATF by firing the current director and appointing a new director that would carry out more industry-friendly policies. That would probably be the biggest practical change if you're assuming all things stay relatively the same as they've been and just have another Trump presidency closer to the first one than some of the more radical stuff he said on the trail. And so I guess bottom line, in a normal scenario where things don't change dramatically after this election, it's going to be difficult for any candidate, for either candidate to actually implement significant changes to American gun policy. The best they can hope for probably is using executive actions to work around the margins. Now, sometimes that can be significant, like President Biden's pistol brace ban had a pretty broad effect. Millions of Americans were potentially implicated in that regulation, which has since been blocked by the courts and is, I think, less likely to survive. The Supreme Court then That's where I see it. I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts on. I got a little bit tongue-tied in there just because it's like, to me, it's hard to look at this election and some of the stuff that like Trump has said and then go back to, well, if all things remain normal, this is where it would end up. And even for Harris, like that's one of I think the more legitimate concerns you could have about her is that while packing the court or nuking the filibuster isn't the same as undoing an election, it still would be a radical change to, I think, for the negative to the way the country functions, the way the government functions. So those seem like higher level concerns than policy stuff. I don't know. That's what I struggle with. I'll be honest, just to be honest with everybody.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Under normal parameters, it's going to be pretty hemmed in as far as any federal action on guns, just by the nature of we're a very divided country. Power is pretty evenly divided, even when one side comes out ahead. Right. But in the more extreme and radical scenarios, it's hard to really game out what could happen.
I don't know. I just don't know. I'm not guaranteeing.
I don't think anyone knows. I don't think anyone knows, and that's the thing.
Anything. That's my problem is when people try to guarantee that it won't go one way or the other. I just don't know what'll happen.
Right.
But people come here for gun policy stuff, and that's where, like, all things remaining equal and stable, and as they've been, I think it's probably hard to see a path for either candidate to actually enact significant federal gun policy changes. Because Harris is going to have to deal with Republican Senate. And even if she didn't, like when Democrats had control at the beginning of the Biden administration, they didn't nuke the filibuster. Now, you could obviously argue that it's a different pack of Democrats now. The people who were mainly publicly opposed to doing that aren't there anymore. Manchin and Sinema aren't going to be around. But even if they did nuke it, you'd still probably struggle with with a close majority to actually get 50 votes for an assault weapons ban in the Senate. That's why they didn't put that when the House passed it a couple of years ago. It never went up for a vote in the Senate. And I think that's one of the reasons why they didn't have 50 Democrats on board with something like that. And I think to get a majority in the Senate, Democrats have to have your more, there may not be fully pro-gun, like you might not have a gun rights activist Democrat senator anymore, but you're going to have Democratic senators who are, if you want to be have any kind of significant majority, you're likely going to have some that are opposed to assault weapons bans at the very least. So if you're just looking at all things being equal, and the same thing for Republicans, when Trump had control of the Senate, when Republicans controlled all three, Senate, House, presidency, they didn't pass any significant gun policy changes. So it really comes down to what could they do from an executive standpoint. And that's where I think the Supreme Court and the federal courts are limiting them even more and more than they have been in the past on that question. And so probably the biggest potential change would be the ATF with Trump appointing a more industry-friendly director than what's in there now with Dettelbach. And that could happen, although I guess you look back to the previous Trump administration, he tried to appoint an ATF director and was shot down by Republicans, specifically Ted Cruz, if I recall correctly, because they thought that the ATF director that Trump put up was too liberal. So I don't know. But that's where, if I'm looking at all things stable, if we're making that assumption, it's hard to imagine, at least for the first 2 years, right? Because obviously then you get another election after that. But at least for the first 2 years, it's hard to imagine very significant changes to gun policy. And I think under a Harris administration, especially, while she may support court packing, these sort of more radical things, right? Court packing and nuking the filibuster, it's very hard to see a scenario where she's going to be able to do that, because it's very hard to picture a scenario where Republicans don't win control of the Senate based on, again, the polling that we're seeing now. we don't know what's going to happen on election day, but that's just where you see things, where I see things at this point. So
yeah,
I don't know. Read the piece; it's a little more straightforward than what I've talked about here, because it's hard to articulate this stuff. Like I'm so used to just talking straightforward, like policy, things are going to be what they've been. And here's how the politics of that play out. Here's how the policies are likely to go, when there's a significant possibility that things aren't just going to be the way they've been, that there could be some significant change to how our government functions, based on what the candidates have said on the trail, especially Donald Trump. And it comes down to what you think of what he said and which parts you believe and which parts you think are overblown or jokes or whatever. But that's, that's where, that's where I've got. Anyway, let's quickly go through some of these headlines before I get too much more into talking. I think people get it, right?
Well, we also wanted to hit on the Washington Free Beacon story. There's an interesting pushback going on among the sort of hunters and anglers community, because the Harris Walz campaign, especially Tim Walz, is making a concerted effort to try to put together affinity groups, hunters and anglers for Walz, and they're trying to make a play to appeal to those types of constituencies. And you're seeing pushback from those organizations that represent those interests saying, don't buy it because you guys have actually taken concrete policy steps that have harmed the interests of hunters and anglers.
Right. So getting back to that kind of our normal politics stuff, like here you see, a campaign put together an interest group, or whatever, not even really a group. It's similar to Gun Owners for Trump, where it's kind of just a hat you can buy or a sign you can get, a sticker you can get. Like that's what I think this Harris, what anglers and hunters and anglers for Harris Walz thing is. And, it was, he announced it with a photo op of him hunting where they weren't very successful. I guess they didn't actually find any pheasants or fire a single shot, but regardless, that's the thing. They put together this group, and this goes back to kind of what we were talking about with Tim on the podcast last week, where it's like, I don't think they're actually trying to get people who have hunting as one of their top priorities with this. I think they're just trying to put out the sort of more of a vibes thing, more of a CYA, like, look, we like hunting too. They're doing it last second, and they don't offer up any substantial policy concessions to hunters. And as the Free Beacon story lays out pretty well, your major hunting and gun industry groups are not happy with the Biden-Harris administration, because they've restricted hunting lands. They've tried to implement, different restrictions on hunting ammunition, things like that. So, good piece, interesting story where they, went and tracked down at least the group's most representative of the people that Harris Walz are supposedly trying to reach with this effort.
The last story we want to touch on comes to us from the New York Times. They report that the survivors of the mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine, the family members, they've at least announced plans to potentially sue the Army over negligence, after this obviously comes in the wake of all these commissions and reports showing that there were all these missed opportunities to intervene in the shooter's sort of descent into more increasingly paranoid and erratic behavior. They've, I guess, formally notified the Army that a lawsuit will be coming unless some sort of internal review happens and reform happens from the Army itself. So this will be an interesting thing to watch, because it comes sort of in a string. This is a trend that we're starting to see in these mass shootings in the aftermath.
Yeah. Because, there's obviously a lot of legal precedent out there that establishes the most government entities in most circumstances don't have a duty to protect you, right, as a individual. And so it's often very difficult to sue the government for failing to, protect people in most circumstances. But we have started to see some of these mass shooting survivors or the victims' families have success in this area of trying to hold government entities accountable for the failures that led up to the shootings. Certainly, I think in the main incident, there were very, very clear government failures at several levels, including within the Army, that resulted in somebody who was very unstable being able to carry out a mass shooting attack, mass murder. So, like you said, there's been a string of these in recent times with Sutherland Springs, Parkland, and now this Maine shooting. And that's an interesting trend. I think we definitely are going to continue to follow and try to maybe look a little bit closer at, how are they getting around some of these doctrines, like the Castle Rock decision out of Colorado, where there was a decision involving the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. There's been a number that established this sort of legal immunity for law enforcement and government entities that don't act to, protect individuals. Like there's no, like the police don't have a legal duty to stop somebody from harming you necessarily. And so how does that play in when we're talking about, the Army and its negligence in dealing with this person who was unstable and violent? It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. And maybe you could do a piece that looks at some of what we've seen in this recent trend and how they're maneuvering with these legal precedents in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's becoming more and more common. So it's certainly something worth our time.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us, right? A lot of my difficulty articulating what I'm trying to get across with the first level concern, second level. Yeah, hopefully that made sense and doesn't bother too many people. I'm just trying to get across how I'm feeling on this stuff and what makes it difficult to cover, because obviously I'm much more used to and inclined to cover the specific policy fights. And I think that's what most of you are here for, but I'm just trying to be honest about how I feel about it sometimes. So anyway, you have anything fun planned this weekend?
Not that probably working. It's been a pretty busy week for me. So probably working, unfortunately.
Oof, that's rough. I think I'm going to the caverns out here in Virginia, Luray, and I think Skyline is the one we're going to. My girlfriend really wants to see the caves for fall and the fall foliage. It's all over by the West Virginia border, so it's very nice out that way, and should be fun. Hopefully, I'm looking forward to watching a Flyers game that starts before 10 p.m. Eastern. We have our Russian superstar prospect got his first 2 goals this week at 1 a.m. So I've been a little tired from staying up to watch. Of course, that's exciting, and then they'll lose the game anyway. So it's just, it's good. Moving on from the Phillies to the Flyers now. Always smart. Just constantly keep the disappointment churning.
Say the life of a Philly sports fan.
Pretty much. All right. Well, I think I'll hand it off to myself now to tell people a little bit more about the Dispatch. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Alla Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news in the same way that we do here at the Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.